decided to challenge this play. He has tossed down the red flag.
Don't forget they have to have good reason to overturn the official's decision.
After review the play, the ruling on the field stands as called and a touchdown.
Hey guys, so glad to have you with us for episode 2 of After Further Review, where Jeff and I challenge each other to look at some biblical interpretations and basically throw down the red flag, right? Challenge the popular or common understanding and just kind of take a closer frame by frame look at whatever passage we challenge each other with. So Jeff really had me up late for this one, so I'm really looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you from my study on this. We all go through difficult, hard things in life, right? One of the most significant times for Taryn and I was when our son Brock was in the hospital from about 3 weeks old until he was a couple of months old. He was in the hospital several weeks. He had bacterial meningitis that caused a stroke, and also encephalitis, which caused seizures about every 10 minutes or more. It's not the kind of thing you would wish on your worst enemy, right? To have to sit there and watch your newborn baby spasming uncontrollably on a hospital bed, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's a term I learned during that time called hospital theology, which basically just involves a lot of the ideas about God or religious platitudes that we tend to extend to families in the midst of suffering or pain because we just don't really know what else to say, but we want to say something. And this one is usually intended as an encouragement, but on several occasions we were told God never gives you more than you can handle. It's meant to be encouraging, but when you're in the throes of that kind of despair, that can actually be a hurtful thing to hear. That's a hard one to hear when you are gasping for a spiritual breath from God because you just feel completely hopeless, lost in pain. So this is one of those phrases that we need to look at more closely, I think. The first thing to ask is that phrase found in the Bible? And the answer is sort of, okay? That's not exactly what it says. But even what it does say, we need to look at in context and take a closer look at. But before we do that, I'm going to look at a couple passages from 2 Corinthians, all right? Paul, later, after he writes the passage that we're going to look at later, he seems to believe and suggest that he was given more than he could handle. Just read the anguish in his language in 2 Corinthians almost every chapter. In chapter 6, he just lists out all these things: trouble, hardship, distress, beatings, imprisonments, going hungry, on and on and on. And in chapter 1, he says, we were so utterly burdened beyond our own strength, beyond our own ability to endure, that we despaired for life itself. Paul wanted to die. It sure seemed like Paul felt like what he was experiencing was more than he could handle, right? But what he says next is pretty amazing. Right after that, in chapter 1, verse 9 of 2 Corinthians, he says, this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. I hear Paul saying basically this: life happens. Life is really hard. It may be God instigating that kind of testing, that kind of hardship. And if that's the case, the purpose of it is to recognize your need for God and the strength that only God provides. But Paul does not say that God instigates every test or every trial or every hardship in life that we undergo. So often it's just life or the world that brings those hardships. And I don't think any one of us are wise enough to discern between when a trial is brought on by God or by Satan or simply by life in the world, but Paul does say that regardless of where it comes from, it can have purpose. So we do experience more than we can handle, whether it's given or ordained by God or simply just by life itself. Either way, we need to look at the passage in question a little bit closer and in context. So let's start reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul says this, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." So let's just talk about the context of all of 1 Corinthians for a second. One of Paul's main messages and concerns is this: having concern for the body of Christ and what loving the body, what loving that community looks like. And in the more immediate context here, Paul is warning them to guard against idolatry, to guard against pride. Taryn and I watched that new Tom Hanks movie that came out called News of the World the other day, which comes from the book by the same name. And in one scene, Captain Kidd is trying to explain to this little girl that life is about looking forward. Life is a line, he says, and we don't look back, always forward. That is the American way. And in her Kiowa language, this little girl says that we can't just look forward, but we also have to look to the side, behind us, above us, around us, all over, because that's how we understand where we are. Exactly what Paul is trying to help them do. Look back, right? Far back to the Exodus, so that they can also understand where they are in their current time as well, and that they'll have the right kind of tools to think about their current situation. The Corinthians seemed to think that they'd been vaccinated against falling prey to idolatry, so Paul has some harsh warnings for them. Essentially what he says is, be careful you don't walk all the way straight back into Egypt while bragging about your freedom, right? Don't walk back into slavery while you're bragging about the freedoms that you have in Christ. What he says is the Israelites essentially had a baptism of sorts. They had a Lord's Supper, so to speak, in their way, but that did not inoculate them against idolatry. God ended up destroying thousands of them because he was upset with them. And Paul's warning to the Corinthians is that, these religious things that we do, such as the Lord's Supper, these things that we do like baptism, they aren't these magical incantations that just produce these immediate transformational effects by going through the motions. I was actually texted today and asked, how often do you think we should take the Lord's Supper? And, that's a huge question, because I think really if we could understand the Lord's Supper the same way that the first Christians really understood it, that the how often question probably would not be as high on our list, near the top of that list of questions, but we'll say that for another time. But the Corinthians thought that merely going through the motions of the Lord's Supper from week to week, which meant that it wasn't in fact the Lord's Supper that they were taking. If they were going through the motions, they weren't really taking the Lord's Supper, Paul tells them. But they thought that would make them basically spiritually invincible. Just make sure I take the Lord's Supper. I came across a quote in my study of this topic of pride and idolatry that I felt like was just so pertinent for our culture today, and wanted to share it with you. It said this: "It is so easy for Christians to make the enemies that we face seem like straw men, which can be pushed aside easily with a verse or a religious platitude, when actually they are powerful, persuasive, and persistent opponents who often invade our hearts and minds and take us captive before we even know they are near. The evil we face in life is a master of disguise." Paul moves on from that point to a word of encouragement and both warning, however you look at it. But what he says is this: "You have not experienced any temptation that isn't common to man." So personally, I gather 3 different lessons from that one sentence, and you can take them for what they're worth. But the first thing I feel like, at least I learned from it, is if you feel like you aren't tempted by things, like you've just got it all figured out, which maybe somebody feels that way, think again, right? Temptation, testing is common. No one is exempt from that. And then the second thing that at least I hear in Paul's words here is, if you're in the throes of battle with temptation, know that someone, maybe more people than you realize, have been there. This is one of the powerful things about community that God provides us. But then the third thing that I feel like he's saying is also realize that everyone is dealing with testing of some kind, with temptation of some sort. No one is immune to every temptation that's out there. And that's a strong reminder for me. Be patient with one another. Be gentle with one another. They're likely going through a battle that you aren't even aware of. But that brings us to the second part of verse 13, which we're going to focus on for just for a second here. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Notice that Paul is not talking about the general circumstances and hardships of life. He is talking specifically here about temptation. He's not saying God won't give you more than you can handle. Rather, God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can handle, beyond what you can bear. So a word study that we really should take just a moment to address here, but we don't have time to cover this fully, is that we have in English both the word tempt and test. Well, the Hebrew word for those words, nasa, and in Greek, perazzo, they encompass both of those terms. And so when we see tempt or test, it comes from one word, and we have to infer from the context alone which connotation is actually more appropriate. Does the author intend to convey more of a tempting or more of a testing? And so we have to kind of look at the paragraph, look at the context, and try to figure out which one is it? Because we understand in our language, a temptation and a test are sometimes subtly different and sometimes vastly different. But for instance, you look at James 1:13, he says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone." So that's the Greek word peirazo, and most biblical scholars and translators look at that context and say, okay, well, I think temptation makes the most sense in this context as opposed to testing. Because in Deuteronomy 8, the Hebrew word nasa, Deuteronomy 8:2 says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands." So the translators in that instance felt like, at least for this translation, that test made more sense than tempt, even though they're the same word in Hebrew. So this whole topic really deserves another class by itself, and maybe we'll do that at some point. But for now, as far as this passage is concerned, know that it could make a small difference here how you render peirazo. For other passages, it's, I think, far more vital to consider which English word is best. You need to talk about whether it's a tempting or a testing that the author is trying to convey. But for now, hone in on what it is that God won't allow, all right? Not that we won't be handed more hardship in life than we feel like we can handle, okay? That's not it. Rather, that God won't allow us to experience a test or temptation that through his strength we can't overcome. So what Paul is saying is still very good news, right? That God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our strength. But when it comes to life's hardships, when it comes to life's difficulties, we should be prepared to experience more than we feel like we can handle so that we can learn to turn to God as the source of strength, as the source of every breath, instead of looking for that merely within ourselves. But either way, look to God, for he is faithful. Do feel free to email Jeff or myself with questions or pushback on this topic or any other topic that we talk about. But for next week, I want to basically throw the challenge flag out on another call. This one doesn't exactly have an obvious ruling on the field. There's been a lot of confusion over the years, over the millennia, and a lot of different opinions and ideas about what it could mean. But I'm talking about the mark of the beast. Some say it's a literal mark. Some say it's invisible and you can't see it. I've even heard lately from multiple people that there are theories surrounding the COVID vaccines, and could that have something to do with the mark of the beast? So, Jeff, I want you to take a look at that. Give us an honest look at what the mark of the beast means next week. I hope you'll all be able to tune in for that. Have a great week. God bless you guys.
And the coach has decided to challenge this play. He has tossed down the red flag.
Don't forget they have to have good reason to overturn the official's decision.
Have to review the play.